The evening rush at Bella's Bistro was in full swing, a buzz of activity filling the air. The clink of glasses, the sizzle of food on the grill, and the chatter of eager diners created a lively atmosphere that was unmistakably characteristic of this local hotspot. As waitresses rushed back and forth, balancing trays of perfectly plated dishes, there was one particular server who stood out, not for her skill, but for her sharp tongue and unmistakable arrogance. Her name was Madison, and she'd been working at the bistro for just over a year. But in that short time, she'd made a name for herself, not for her customer service, but for her sharp wit and biting comments, especially when it came to certain types of customers. On this particular evening, she was about to meet someone who would change her perspective forever. At a corner booth, a man sat alone. His frame was large, his clothes simple yet well-fitted, but it was his demeanor that caught the attention of those around him. His calm presence contrasted sharply with the chaos of the bustling restaurant. He didn't speak much, didn't make eye contact with anyone, and seemed content with his own company. But Madison, fresh off a minor tiff with another customer, was feeling particularly snarky that evening. The man, who appeared to be in his 40s, had placed his order quietly, giving no indication that he was anything but a regular diner. However, as Madison approached his table with her usual brisk stride, she couldn't help but notice his size. It wasn't lost on her that he was overweight, something she'd seen too often in her years of waiting tables. She had a habit of making subtle remarks about people's appearances, especially those who didn't seem to fit her idea of health or beauty. And tonight, she couldn't resist. "Are you sure you can handle the burger and fries?" she asked, her voice dripping with condescension, though she tried to mask it with a smile. "You might want to think about getting a salad instead." The man looked up, his eyes meeting hers for a brief moment before he smiled politely. "I'll take the burger, thank you," he said calmly, his tone unfazed by her words. Madison, however, was hardly deterred. She'd gotten away with comments like these before, and it only seemed to amuse her to push people's buttons. "I guess you can always work it off later," she added with a wink, turning away before he could respond. As she walked away, she couldn't help but chuckle to herself. She was used to being the center of attention, and when it came to her cutting remarks, most people either laughed them off or let them roll off their backs. But this man, he didn't react. He hadn't even flinched. Madison wasn't sure what to make of it. He was just another overweight customer after all, probably someone who didn't care enough about their health to take her advice. She continued her duties, weaving between tables, checking on drinks and orders. But something about the man lingered in her thoughts. She hadn't expected him to be so quiet, so unbothered by her comment. In her experience, people who looked like him usually had something to say, whether it was in defense or anger. But not him. It was only when the night began winding down, and the last few customers were finishing up, that the man stood up from his table. Madison had just finished clearing a nearby table when she saw him walk toward the hostess stand. She wasn't paying much attention at first, but then something unusual happened. The hostess, a young woman who had only recently started working at Bella's Bistro, gasped. "Mr. Carter," the hostess exclaimed, her face lighting up with recognition. Madison paused, suddenly intrigued. She glanced over her shoulder as Mr. Carter, her overweight, quiet customer, pulled a set of keys from his pocket and handed them to the hostess. "I'll be heading out now. Everything looked great tonight, as usual," he said, his voice warm but firm. Madison froze. She had no idea who this man was, but the way the hostess had greeted him, it wasn't like she'd greeted any regular customer. And the keys, it was clear that he was more than just a diner. As Madison turned back to the table where Mr. Carter had been sitting, her curiosity was piqued. What was going on? Who was this man? And why had she never heard of him before? Before she could gather her thoughts, the hostess walked past her, her eyes wide with excitement. "I can't believe he came in tonight," she whispered to one of the other waitstaff. "Mr. Carter is the owner of the restaurant." Madison's heart skipped a beat. She had just mocked the man who owned the place. Her mind raced, panic slowly creeping in as the weight of the situation hit her. She had no idea who she'd just insulted. All she knew was that she'd crossed a line, and now there was no turning back. As Madison stood frozen, trying to process what had just happened, she could feel the tension in the air shift. The sound of the kitchen grew louder. The murmur of voices from the dining room seemed to fade, and her own heartbeat thudded in her ears. What would Mr. Carter do? Would he confront her? Would he fire her? Or was he the type of man who preferred to stay silent, letting the consequences of her actions unfold in their own time? The restaurant felt like it was holding its breath, waiting for the inevitable. And in that moment, Madison realized that this night was about to change everything, both for her and for Bella's Bistro. She just had no idea how far the consequences would stretch, or what Mr. Carter's next move would be. As she stood there, unsure of what to do next, she couldn't shake the feeling that the story was far from over. What would happen when the truth came out? Would she be able to redeem herself, or had she just sealed her fate? The questions lingered in the air, unanswered, as the door to the back office closed softly behind her. The next chapter of Madison's life was about to begin, but would it be a story of redemption or one of regret? The next few days at Bella's Bistro were like a storm cloud hanging over Madison's head. She couldn't shake the memory of her words, the easy mockery she had made of Mr. Carter, the man who owned the place. Every time she walked into work, the tension in the air felt thick, like the calm before a downpour. The other waitstaff had noticed the shift in her demeanor. They had always known Madison to be brash, quick with a joke or a snide comment, but now she was quieter, more withdrawn. It wasn't just the fact that Mr. Carter owned the bistro that unsettled her. It was the unknown, the uncertainty of what he would do next. Madison's mind replayed the scene over and over again. She tried to convince herself that it wasn't a big deal. After all, she had made jokes like that before, and people just brushed them off. But this was different. There was something about Mr. Carter, his calmness, the way the hostess had reacted, that left her feeling exposed. He hadn't fired her on the spot, which in her mind was a small mercy. But the uncertainty gnawed at her. Why hadn't he confronted her? Was he planning something else? Maybe he was giving her a chance to redeem herself, or maybe he was waiting for the right moment to make an example out of her. The night of the next shift, Madison arrived early, trying to get a sense of the atmosphere. She didn't want to seem too obvious, but she couldn't help it. She kept stealing glances toward the back office where Mr. Carter usually worked. She had been told that he rarely made an appearance in the dining area, preferring to stay behind the scenes, overseeing the operations and making decisions that kept the bistro running smoothly. But tonight, there was a different energy. The usual clatter of dishes and conversation seemed muted, and even the other waitstaff seemed more on edge than usual. Her shift began as any other, serving drinks, taking orders, and moving between tables. But the weight of her earlier actions hung over her like a shadow. Every time she approached a table, she wondered if someone had heard what she'd said to Mr. Carter. Could her mistake have already spread through the staff? She tried to ignore it, but she couldn't help but notice the occasional glance cast her way. She knew they were talking about her, whispering in hushed tones. The waitress who had mocked the boss, how would that story play out? Then, just as the evening was starting to wind down, Mr. Carter walked into the main dining area. Madison's heart jumped into her throat. He wasn't wearing a suit or anything formal. Instead, he had on a simple black t-shirt and jeans, his demeanor still calm, but there was something different about him tonight. There was no arrogance in the way he walked, no sign of resentment in his face. He seemed just like any other customer, yet there was a quiet authority about him that commanded attention. As he made his way to the bar, Madison watched him, trying to keep a low profile. Her thoughts raced. Would he address her now? Would he pull her aside and fire her on the spot? She didn't know what to expect. For a moment, it felt as though time stood still. The noise in the restaurant dimmed, and her world seemed to narrow down to just the space between her and Mr. Carter. He didn't head straight for the back office like she expected. Instead, he ordered a drink from the bar and sat at a table near the front. It was almost as though he was waiting for something, but what? Madison tried to shake off the unease that settled deep in her chest. The night passed slowly, and just as Madison was starting to think she might escape without a confrontation, Mr. Carter stood up. He walked over to the hostess stand, nodded at the young woman who greeted him, and then made his way toward her. Madison's breath hitched. This was it. The moment of truth. He was coming for her. He stopped just a few feet away, standing still for a moment. His eyes locked with hers, and there was a brief silence. Madison tried to maintain her composure, but her hands were trembling. She had no idea what he was going to say, and every possible scenario rushed through her mind. Was he going to make an example of her in front of everyone? Was this her last night at Bella's Bistro? Instead of launching into some grand speech, Mr. Carter simply looked at her for a moment, as if weighing something. Then, with a small smile that didn't quite reach his eyes, he spoke quietly, but his words were sharp enough to cut through the air. "I think you owe me an apology, don't you think?" The words hung in the air, and Madison felt the color drain from her face. She hadn't expected him to speak so directly, so calmly. She had been bracing herself for something more confrontational, but his approach threw her off. The calmness in his voice only made it worse. It was like he wasn't angry, just disappointed. Madison's mind raced. She had wanted to brush the whole thing off, pretend it hadn't happened. But now, in front of him, there was no escaping it. She opened her mouth to say something, but the words stuck in her throat. What could she say? How could she apologize for something like that, for mocking someone who had done nothing wrong? "Look, Mr. Carter, I didn't," she started, but he raised a hand, cutting her off. "I'm not interested in excuses," he said, his voice still even. "I just want you to understand something. People in my restaurant are my responsibility. Everyone who walks through that door deserves respect, regardless of how they look or who they are. Your words have consequences, Madison." She opened her mouth again, but before she could respond, he turned away, walking toward the back office. Madison stood there, her mind racing. She had no idea what he was going to do next, but something told her that this wasn't the end. It wasn't just a reprimand, it was a warning. The conflict between them had only just begun, and the tension that had been simmering beneath the surface was about to boil over. Madison wasn't sure what kind of power Mr. Carter had in this place, but she knew one thing for sure. Her actions had set something in motion that she couldn't undo. What would happen to her now? Would she be fired, or was he planning something else? Whatever it was, she wasn't ready for it, and the uncertainty of it all weighed heavily on her as the night stretched on with the threat of the inevitable hanging over her head. The following days at Bella's Bistro felt like walking on eggshells for Madison. Every time she passed Mr. Carter's office or walked through the dining room, she half expected him to pull her aside and give her a final warning, or worse, let her go. The tension between them simmered, thickening with every interaction, but nothing came of it. Mr. Carter remained distant, almost neutral, while Madison tried to act like nothing had happened. But deep down, she knew she couldn't just move on. Her actions had ignited something, and it felt like she was just waiting for the inevitable. One evening, as the restaurant began to fill with customers, Madison was preparing to take an order when she noticed Mr. Carter walking through the dining area again. This time, however, he wasn't alone. He had a group of people with him, 4 others, all sharply dressed, moving with purpose. Madison's pulse quickened. She hadn't seen him with such a group before. They weren't the typical business associates she had imagined him with. These were different. There was an air of authority about them. As Mr. Carter approached her station, his eyes met hers. There was something unsettling in the way he looked at her, calm, yet intense. He motioned for her to come over. "Madison," he said, his voice steady, "I need you to do something for me." Her throat tightened, unsure of what he was about to say. "Of course, Mr. Carter," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm about to make a special announcement," he began, his eyes never leaving hers. "And you'll need to be a part of it. I want you to join us in the back room after the dinner rush. Bring the rest of the staff. It's important." Madison's mind raced. What kind of announcement was this? Why had he asked her? The uncertainty that had plagued her for days returned, and with it came a nervous excitement. She was on the edge of something, but what? The evening passed in a blur. Madison continued to work, trying to focus, but her thoughts kept drifting. Finally, when the last customer had been served, and the noise of the bistro began to quiet, she made her way to the back room. There, Mr. Carter was waiting, along with a group of sharp-dressed people. The entire staff gathered around, some whispering among themselves, all of them curious about what was going on. Mr. Carter stood at the front, his eyes scanning the room. The tension was palpable. He waited for a moment, as if deciding how to begin before he spoke. "Some of you may be wondering why I've asked you here tonight," he began, his voice steady. "Well, the truth is, I've been watching this restaurant closely, more closely than you know. And I've noticed a few things, some things that need to be addressed." Madison's heart skipped a beat. This wasn't just about her anymore. He was talking to everyone, addressing the entire team. "Over the past few weeks," Mr. Carter continued, "I've seen some of you slip into bad habits. I've seen staff members ignoring customers, taking shortcuts, and not living up to the standards we've set here at Bella's. But tonight, I'm here to announce a change, a big change." The room was silent as Mr. Carter paused. Madison's palms grew clammy. What was he about to say? "I'm bringing in a new management team to help turn things around. This place needs a fresh start. We need to go back to our roots, the things that made Bella's Bistro the restaurant it is today. And part of that is holding ourselves accountable for everything we do, from the way we treat customers to the way we treat each other." Madison's eyes flicked nervously to the others. Some of the staff looked uneasy, others skeptical, but no one spoke. "And that includes you, Madison," Mr. Carter said, his voice calm but firm. Madison froze. She had expected to be reprimanded, but the way he said her name made it sound different. There was something more. "I've decided not to fire you," he continued, pausing for effect. "Instead, I'm giving you a chance to prove yourself. I want you to step up, to lead by example. If you can do that, if you can change the way you treat people, starting with your fellow staff and our customers, then you'll earn back the trust you lost." Madison felt a rush of relief wash over her. She had expected the worst, but instead, she was being given a second chance. It wasn't going to be easy, but it was a chance nonetheless. She nodded, her throat tight as she fought to hold back the flood of emotion. "I won't disappoint you," she said, her voice more confident than she felt. Mr. Carter nodded, as if he expected nothing less. "I know you won't." With that, he turned to the rest of the staff. "Now, I know this won't be easy for all of us, but if we're going to make Bella's Bistro the best it can be, we have to do it together. And that means holding each other accountable, no excuses. I'm counting on every one of you to make it happen." The room was still. For a moment, no one said anything. Then, one by one, the staff nodded, understanding the weight of what had been said. The change was coming, and it was up to them to decide how they would rise to meet it. Madison felt a sense of relief. She had been given a chance to redeem herself, not just with Mr. Carter, but with the people around her. And that was something she couldn't take for granted. The bistro would never be the same. There would be changes, and there would be challenges. But one thing was clear: she was ready to face them head-on. The past few days had been a wake-up call for her, a reminder that words had power, and so did actions. It was time to prove that she could do better, that she could be better. As she left the back room that night, something inside her shifted. The old Madison, the one who made fun of others and hid behind sarcasm, was gone. She was ready to step into a new role, one where respect, leadership, and kindness were the foundation. The next chapter of her life was just beginning. And this time, she was ready to write a new story, one where she didn't just fit in, but where she led by example. And as the door to Bella's Bistro swung open, Madison stepped out into the night, ready for whatever came next. The journey ahead wouldn't be easy, but it would be worth it. The lesson had been learned, and the stakes had never been higher.